students, today we're going to talk about the abolitionists, and these are the people who wanted to do it with slavery. I'm going to break this into two pretty small screencasts. Okay, the early abolition movement was just groups of people who thought that slavery could be done away with a little at a time, and that involved people even before the Constitution was written. So in the Constitution, they wrote in that there would be no more slave trade after 1808, and the people who wrote the Constitution pretty much figured that this would phase slavery out over time. And honestly, by the early 1800s, a lot of northern states had outlawed it on their own because they just didn't agree with it. And again, I probably call your attention to the last bullet point that Quakers were among the first to speak out against slavery, even way before independence happened for United States. Okay, but the problem was the cotton gin. With the invention of the cotton gin, cotton crops spread across the South, slavery spread across the South with it, and it increased, the cotton gin, while Whitney had not, that wasn't his purpose with the cotton gin. That's what happened with it, is that cotton spread across the South. And I've got a little graph here to show you. The red line is cotton production in bales, and the blue line is slave population. By 1860, there were 4 million people enslaved across the South. A horrendous amount of people enslaved. All right, so some people who don't own slaves, Northerners who don't own slaves, they still believe in the legality of slavery, and other Northerners don't know what to do about it. They're like, well, if we free all the slaves all at once, what will happen to them? Most of them are illiterate, not of their own doing. It's not their fault. No one's been able to teach them to read and write. Most Southerners don't want them to read and write, and so they haven't been able to learn to read and write, and they only know the skill that their masters had taught them or wanted them to learn. And in 1816, that's just after the War of 1812 is over, a group of people form this, sorry, got to stop the dog from squeaking her toy. All right, now that Mr. Squeaky Pig has been dealt with. The plan was to buy part of Africa to, when these people were liberated, when they became free, that it would be okay that they would be able to go back to Africa. And it wasn't an Andrew Jackson type of plan. This wasn't an Andrew Jackson type of plan where we're going to move these people off of their land, and they weren't trying to boot the slaves out of meanness. The thought was, these people were forcibly removed from their homeland. We're going to buy a little piece of Africa where they can go back to where they came from, not because we don't want them here, but because this is what they would want to do if they had their own free will. And you see up here on my map of Africa, this little red piece right here, this is Liberia. And that still, I think, is a place today. I'm not the world cultures teacher or the world geography teacher either, but I think Liberia is still a place. Obviously, the United States doesn't own it anymore, but it still is a place in the world, okay? Some slaves did actually end up going back there of their own free will. The Northerners that were trying to help out hired boats, and they said, now that you're free, if you want to go back, you can go back there. We've made this place for you. And some slaves did choose to go back because who would want to stay in the South, really? Okay, but by the 1830s, a lot of people are losing patience with this idea of this gradual decrease in slavery because it wasn't happening. They were waiting for it to go away, but it wasn't happening. And so one of the very early people that you need to know is William Lloyd Garrison. He started writing an anti-slavery newspaper called The Liberator, and you will have to know him for a test. And you will have to know that he wrote The Liberator as a newspaper. And he called for the immediate release of slaves. And he's like, well, I don't care what the consequences are. We will deal with whatever the consequences are at the time. If we have to teach them to read and write or whatever we have to do, slavery is immoral. It needs to be gotten rid of. And, yesterday is not soon enough. We have to do it now. Another couple of interesting people who were early crusaders against slavery were these two women. They're kind of scary looking if you see the picture down at the bottom. They were the Grimke sisters, and we sort of treat them together because they crusaded as a partnership, as a pair. They were born into wealthy landowning family in South Carolina. one of the richest families in South Carolina who owned slaves, lots of them. But they pretty much on their own saw the immorality of slavery, and they, as soon as they got old enough and could, they left and went to the North to help fight against slavery and also for women's rights. Notice how it overlaps. I told you some of these, especially abolition and women's rights, overlap. Okay, a lot of them work in the same people working for two different causes because they're kind of the same cause. Women weren't slaves, but they also didn't have any rights, as you'll see when I talk about the women's rights movement. So what happened with these women was when their family, when their parents died, and there was time for an inheritance, they asked specifically. They didn't want any of the family's land. They didn't want any of the family's money. They simply wanted whatever would have been their share of the inheritance, but they wanted it in slaves. They said, just give us that much money or that much inheritance in slaves. And of course, what they did with the slaves was to turn around and immediately free them, bring them to the North with them, and set them free, because that was their purpose, is to free as many of them as they could. They also did publish this book down here that I mentioned, American Slavery, which was a powerful book, but not the most powerful one. I don't think American slavery is ever going to be tested. You might want to put in the back of your heads that they wrote a book. All right, the most important book that was published during this time, again, my format is a little bit off, but not so bad, was written by this woman, Harriet Beecher Stowe. You will have to know her. She is part of two reform movements, the literature reform movement, and also an abolitionist. She wrote a fictional book about a fictional slave named Tom who was sold from one family to another, and she describes his circumstances, and sometimes they're not so bad, and other times they're terrible. But the book, I'm sure she must have done some research on this, probably talked to actual escaped slaves to get her storyline. The book was very powerful, like Thomas Paine's Common Sense. So if you were a Northerner, perhaps, that said, yeah, slavery's bad, but, you know, it's down there in the South, it doesn't really affect me, it's not something for me to worry about, but you read this book, you would start worrying about it. It was so bad that in the South it was banned. You weren't allowed to sell it in the South at all or buy it. So it was a very influential book and helped bring people over to the cause of abolition. In fact, Lincoln meets with her later on and says to her, so you're the little woman who wrote the book, who started this great war. She was very, very influential, and you'll have to know her. I'm going to stop here with this screencast and then make another small one.